The ancient world mourns as King David learns of the death of fallen Prince Jonathan.
Yet today, scholars ask this same question not of kings, but of the central pillars of Israel's early history.
For decades, the comparative method was the shield of historicity, seeking parallels between the Bible and the ancient Near East.
These parallels sought to prove that the social and legal practices of Genesis were mirrored in the second millennium BC.
Such parallels were once adduced as ironclad evidence that biblical events were historical and the characters real.
But the tide began to turn as scholars like John Van Seters and Thomas Thompson scrutinized the evidence.
They argued that the so-called parallels were not compelling and could easily belong to the first millennium. The result has been an abandonment by many Old Testament scholars of the conclusions of historical maximalists like Albright, Bright, and Spicer.
Thus, the pendulum began to swing towards a more minimalist reading of the Hebrew Bible. Minimalism cast doubt on the material found in Genesis through Joshua concerning the origin of Israel.
Specifically, the patriarchal, sojourn Exodus, Sinai, and conquest traditions were called into question.
For centuries, the Israelite exodus from Egypt has been considered a historical event central to the formation of ancient Israel as a nation.
The historicity of this event was affirmed by John Bright as recently as 1981 in his History of Israel.
He wrote that ancestors of Israel had been slaves in Egypt and escaped in some marvelous way, claiming almost no one would question it. Since that positive assessment was penned, however, the tide has shifted toward historical minimalism.
This shift led to the questioning or denial of the historicity of the events of Exodus.
In 1986, Gösta Ahlström sought to answer the pressing question of Israel's origin without referring to the commonly dismissed Pentateuch.
His thesis effectively ignored the Book of Joshua, a reductionist approach that changed the landscape. Coote claimed the periods of the patriarchs, Exodus, Conquest, or Judges never existed as devised by the scriptures.
When Bright's claim is read beside those of Ahlström and Coote, with only a decade separating them, the contrast is staggering.
We are forced to ask why the central event in Israel's history has so quickly lost its credibility in the eyes of many leading scholars. No single reason can be offered. In fact, a number of factors have been responsible for this decline and the present crisis.
First, the collapse of the Albright-Wright synthesis of the conquest of Canaan by Joshua. Second, the demise of the Wellhousenian certainties regarding the composition of the Pentateuch.
New literary and sociological approaches now rival older continental methods.
These demographic shifts are unprecedented in the historical record.
Let us now briefly sketch how these developments took place and set the stage for the present investigation. The so-called archaeological date for Israel's militaristic entry into Canaan was a direct result of their discoveries. This conclusion came from Albright's discoveries at Tel Beit Mirsim, which he thought was biblical Debir.
And Wright's work at Beitin, possibly biblical Bethel, further cemented this view.
Writing in the mid-1950s, Wright reflected that the city was destroyed by a tremendous conflagration. He stated there was absolutely no mistaking and the evidences of by far the worst destruction the city experienced.
In some places, the debris of fallen walls and charred, ash-filled earth was almost 5 feet thick.
The Canaanite city destroyed was a fine one, with excellent houses, paved floors, and drains.
Compared with them, the poor, straggly houses of the next town were poverty itself.
The break between the two is so complete that there can be no doubt this was the Israelite destruction.
This correlation between archaeological data and Joshua narratives was the dominant view during the 1960s and 1970s.
It was dubbed the conquest model, firmly rooting the Bible in soil and ash. To be sure, there were those who early on rejected the Albright school's conquest model. In his seminal essay of 1925, Albrecht Alt argued for a gradual migration rather than a wholesale conquest.
He believed Israelite tribes moved into Canaan fairly quietly, utilizing Egyptian historical sources to support his view. Alt and Noth reached these conclusions by largely ignoring the archaeologically based approach of the Albright Rite school.
While Noth did not reject the evidence of destruction, he believed the evidence for assigning it to Israelites was lacking. True, there is nothing about these late Bronze Age destructions that points specifically toward Israel. Ascribing destruction to a perpetrator comes from inferences derived from texts, not the stones themselves.
Martin Noth rejected Albright's thesis, concluding instead that the text of Joshua was...
As the conquest model disintegrated, scholarship swung back to the Alt-Noth hypothesis and its variations.
This view found new life in the works of scholars like Manfred Weipert and Adam Zertal.
Yet, one glaring problem with the infiltration model remained unaddressed by its advocates.
The model failed to explain the demise of the late Bronze Canaanite city-states. Out of the tension between the German peaceful migration and the American military conquest, a third option emerged. George Mendenhall presented the peasant revolt theory in 1962, suggesting the upheaval came from within, not without.
It was a radical shift. Israel did not invade Canaan. They were Canaanites who rebelled against their overlords.
Dever recently hailed Mendenhall's work as one of the most original contributions to 20th century American biblical scholarship. While initially quiet, this model gained popularity when Norman Gottwald expanded upon it with a sociological focus. Gottwald gave the theory a Marxist bent, interpreting the biblical history through the lens of class struggle. However, Mendenhall bristled at the way Gottwald skewed his original thesis.
Mendenhall felt his thesis was being exploited by political propagandists, interested only in socio-political processes. He accused Gottwald of forcing ancient historical data into the Procrustes bed of 9th and 10th century Marxist sociology.
Nevertheless, Gottwald's work influenced recent studies by scholars like Marvin Cheney and Robert Coote.
Anson Rainey, a sharp critic, demurred, calling it a revolting peasant theology.
Revolting peasant theology.
He lamented that this approach had become a popular fad among students and scholars of the Old Testament. Rainey feared it was becoming the new panacea of late 20th century Old Testament studies. Regardless of its future, the Mendenhall-Gottwald theory posed problems for both earlier American and German models.
Perhaps the most severe blow to the conquest theory came not from sociology, but from the ground itself.
The archaeological problems posed at Jericho and at Tel, thought to be Ai, proved insurmountable. These sites are the most thoroughly documented and celebrated victories in the Book of Joshua. The text is explicit. The cities were burned with fire. Therefore, these sites serve as the ultimate test cases for the conquest model and the historicity of the narratives. Excavators searched for the late Bronze Age walls that Joshua would have brought tumbling down.
But at Jericho, the evidence suggests the city was little more than a small settlement, or perhaps unoccupied.
The situation at Etel, biblical Ai, was even more problematic for the traditional account. Excavations revealed that Ai had been a massive city in the early Bronze Age, but was destroyed long before Joshua arrived. During the time of the supposed conquest, there was no city at Ai to be conquered or burned.
This absence of evidence created a crisis, forcing scholars to choose between the biblical text
and the archaeological record.
Noth's explanation that the story was an etiology, a myth to explain the ancient ruins, suddenly
the failure of Jericho and Ai to align with the biblical narrative caused the Albright-Wright synthesis to crumble.
This revealed the circular reasoning often used in biblical archaeology, using the Bible to date the ruins, and the ruins to prove the Bible.
As these pillars fell, the door was opened wide for the minimalist view, that the Bible is theology, not history.
If Joshua didn't conquer the land, and the Exodus didn't happen as described, where did Israel come from?
The focus shifted to finding Israel's origins within Canaan itself, a cultural evolution rather than a military invasion.
This set the stage for reductionist theses like that of Gösta Ahlström, who sought answers without the Pentateuch.
Scholars began to treat the Bible as literature produced centuries later, reflecting the times of the writers, not the events.
The era of biblical archaeology as a means to prove the Bible was effectively over. In its place rose Syro-Palestinian archaeology, a discipline focused on the cultures of the region without a biblical bias.
History and theology, once tightly wed, were now being forced to live in separate houses.
This left a historical vacuum that new theories rushed to fill, often conflicting and competing for dominance.
Critics like Anson Rainey dismissed the peasant revolt theory as a mere academic fad, a revolting peasant theology that would pass with time. Yet, the Marxist undertones of Gottwald's work cast a long shadow, influencing a generation to look for.
Mendenhall watched with frustration as his original insight was transformed into a socio-political manifesto he scarcely recognized. The decline of the conquest model was not due to one cause, but 4 distinct factors that converged to create the present crisis.
The first factor was the undeniable collapse of the archaeological evidence for a unified military conquest.
The second factor was the demise of traditional source criticism, which had long assigned dates to the Pentateuchal sources.
New literary approaches began to read the Bible as a cohesive story, rather than a patchwork of historical documents.
The third factor was a redefining of historiography, rejecting biblical writings as valid sources for reconstructing early history.
Biblical narratives were spurned, no longer seen as windows into the past, but as mirrors reflecting the writer's own later times.
Finally, the hermeneutic of suspicion emerged, a skepticism that assumed the text was guilty of fabrication until proven innocent.
These factors set the stage for a crisis where the central event of Israel's history lost its credibility among scholars.
The synthesis created by William F. Albright, once the bedrock of the discipline, began to erode rapidly.
Albright's identification of Tel Beit Mirsim as biblical Debir was challenged, weakening the link between his excavations and the Bible.
But ash is merely carbon. It does not speak names, nor does it identify the ethnicity of the one who lit the match.
The lack of widespread 13th century destruction layers elsewhere created a void that the conquest model could not fill.
This void forced scholars to return to Albrecht Alti's peaceful infiltration model, despite its own flaws. Yet, the infiltration model still could not explain why the great Canaanite cities collapsed if there was no military conquest.
Mendenhall's revolt theory attempted to solve this by placing the enemy within the gates.
But the imposition of modern sociological categories onto ancient tribes alienated many historians. Anson Rainey urged the field to ignore the revolting peasant theory, hoping to steer scholarship back to the texts and the dirt. No matter which sociological model was proposed, the problem of Jericho stood like a wall blocking the way. At Ai, the disconnect was even more absolute. The city was a ghost town for 1,000 years before Joshua. If Et Tel is indeed Ai, then the biblical narrative of its capture is a fiction. Some scholars tried to relocate Ai or redate the conquest to save the phenomenon, but these efforts failed to convince the majority. Conservative scholars were forced to retreat or reinterpret the text as theological history rather than literal reportage.
Thus,
the pendulum swung fully to the minimalist side, where the history of Israel was seen as a blank slate.
The speed of this shift, from Bright's confidence to Coote's denial in just 1 decade, left the public and many students dizzy. Why has the central event in Israel's history lost its credibility so quickly? The answer lies in the convergence of these critical methods.
The Albright-Wright synthesis could not withstand the combined weight of negative evidence and new methodologies.
Even the old Wellhausen hypothesis was not spared. It too was deconstructed, leaving no stable foundation for dating the text. The hermeneutic of suspicion meant that scholars now assumed the biblical writers had political agendas, not historical interests.
To reconstruct history, scholars turned away from the Bible and towards sociology and anthropology.
Into this intellectual vacuum stepped Gösta Ahlström, offering a history of Israel that largely ignored the biblical saga.
Ahlström's work represents the culmination of this minimalist trend, a thesis we must examine to understand the current landscape.
Just as the potter shapes the clay, the biblical writers shaped their history from the raw material of myths.
The contrast between the marvelous escape described by Bright and the non-existence described by Coote could not be starker.
With the Exodus and conquest removed, the center of Israelite history collapsed, leaving a donut-shaped hole in the past.
The question, who were the Israelites, became the new Holy Grail, sought not in texts, but in the settlement patterns of the highlands.
The emerging consensus was that the Israelites were Canaanites who had simply moved uphill, not invaders from Egypt. The era of the conquest was over. The era of settlement and state formation had begun. Yet the question remains, if the Bible is so wrong about the origins, why did the Israelites invent such a specific story of slavery and escape?
No single reason explains the crisis, and no single theory has yet replaced the shattered consensus.
The stage is now set for our investigation into the reductionist theses that sought to fill this historical void.
We have moved from the certainty of the spade proving the Bible to the suspicion that the spade contradicts it.
The 1970s and 80s witnessed an unrelenting critique that dismantled the comparative method and the conquest model piece by piece.
As we move forward, we must ask, has the pendulum swung too far?
The ancient chronicles begin with a cry of grief that echoes through the corridors of time, a lament for lost greatness.
It was a question of despair for a fallen dynasty, but today, this same question haunts the very foundation.
The giants of the faith, who once stood as unshakable pillars of history, now face a relentless scrutiny.
For years, scholars built a fortress of certainty using the comparative method, linking the Bible to the wider world.
The belief was that these stories were rooted in the specific soil of the mid to early 2nd millennium BC.
This was the age of historical maximalists, scholars who championed the Bible's historical core.
But the bedrock began to crack as a new generation of scholars examined the evidence with a colder, more critical eye. They proposed that these customs could just as easily belong to a much later time, rendering the ancient connection void. The intellectual tide turned violently, moving from faith in the text to a deep skepticism.
Skepticism spread to the foundational narratives of Israel's origins, especially the material found in Genesis through Joshua concerning the origin of Israel. The stories that defined a people, the patriarchs, the sojourn, Sinai, and the conquest, were no longer seen as history. For centuries, the Exodus was the heartbeat of Israelite identity, the event that forged a nation from slaves.
The certainty of this event was still being proclaimed. There can really be little doubt. Affirmed by John Bright in A History of Israel.
To question the escape from Egypt was, at that time, almost unthinkable in mainstream scholarship.
But barely a few years later, the academic ground shifted beneath their feet, and the consensus evaporated.
The new wave of scholarship did not just question the details, it questioned the very existence of the event.
By 1986, Gösta Ahlström was proposing a history of Israel that ignored the biblical books entirely.
The biblical narrative was stripped away, leaving a skeleton of history based only on stones and pottery. Robert Coote took the skepticism even further, claiming the biblical writers were inventing a past they did not know. While the scriptures were useful for understanding the writers, they were deemed useless for understanding the events they described. Although they can provide much information,
the eras of the patriarchs, the Exodus, and the Judges were declared to be literary fictions. The period under discussion, the speed at which the central pillar of Israel's history crumbled was staggering. When Bright's claim is rifle.
Why did a history believed for thousands of years lose its credibility so abruptly?
it was not a single blow, but a combination of intellectual forces that brought down the old structure. The first factor was the disintegration of the archaeological model that supported Joshua's conquest.
The second was the breakdown of traditional theories about how the Bible was written and when. The demise of the well-housed. The third was a redefinition of what history writing actually meant in the ancient world. The redefining of historiography.
Finally, a pervasive mood of skepticism took hold, a hermeneutic of suspicion that doubted the text by default.
To understand this crisis, we must look at how the dominant view was built and how it was dismantled.
For decades, biblical archaeology was defined by the vision of William F. Albright and his student, G. Ernest Wright.
They pinpointed the Israelite arrival to the 13th century BC, based on physical evidence of
At Tel Beit Mirsim, which Albright identified as the biblical city of Debir, he found what he believed was undeniable proof.
The evidence of destruction was massive, a layer of ash and ruin that spoke of a violent end.
G. Ernest Wright, writing in the mid-50s, recalled the awe of uncovering such devastation. It was
the city had been leveled, with walls toppled and the earth choked with ash. In some places, the debris.
The city that was destroyed had been sophisticated, a fine example of Canaanite culture.
In stark contrast, the settlement that followed was primitive, marking a complete cultural break.
This clear distinction between Canaanite and Israelite layers became the standard conquest model for decades. However, not everyone accepted this militaristic picture. German scholars had long proposed a different path.
Albrecht Alt argued that Israel did not conquer the land, but drifted into it slowly.
Rather than a unified invasion under Joshua, it was a peaceful process of settlement. Rather than a wholesale conquest by
Martin Noth expanded this view, likening the Israelites to modern Bedouin moving into settled lands.
Noth believed the land was open enough to accommodate them without war, the only difference being that at that time there was more uninhabited space available than there is today.
Alt and Noth reached these conclusions by analyzing the text, largely ignoring the archaeology that Albright championed.
While Noth admitted cities were destroyed, he saw no proof that Israelites were the destroyers. While Noth
destruction layers exist, but stones do not speak names. True, there is nothing about these late Bronze Age destructions that points toward Israel or any other culprit for that matter.
It is similar to the earlier destructions ending the Middle Bronze Age, often blamed on Egyptians.
Noth dismissed the Book of Joshua as etiology, stories invented to explain ruins, not record battles.
As the conquest model crumbled, scholars returned to the ideas of Alt and Noth. One problem is its failure.
Yet, the infiltration model left a gaping hole in history. It could not explain how the mighty Canaanite city-states met their end.
Caught between the German model of peaceful migration and the American model of military conquest.
In 1962, George Mendenhall proposed that Israel was not an invader, but a movement of the oppressed rising up.
The walls of Canaan were not breached by outsiders,
but by the peasants within, overthrowing their feudal lords.
This theory marked a turning point, moving away from military history toward a sociological understanding of the Bible.
Norman Gottwald took Mendenhall's seed and grew it into a massive, systematic framework.
However, Gottwald interpreted the ancient revolt through the lens of modern Marxist theory, giving it a Marxist bent.
Mendenhall, the originator of the theory, watched this development with growing frustration. However, Mendenhall has bristled at
He warned against reducing the complexity of the ancient world to simple industrial concepts.
Despite the friction, Gottwald's massive work became a cornerstone for a new school of thought. In his magnum opus, Gottwald's sociological model rippled out, influencing scholars like Marvin Chaney and Robert Coote.
The idea of a peasant revolt found a home among those looking for social dynamics rather than divine intervention.
But not all were convinced. Anson Rainey stood as a sharp critic against this sociological trend.
Rainey dismissed the entire Marxist sociological enterprise as a waste of scholarly effort. This book could safely and profitably be ignored.
He saw it not as a breakthrough, but as a passing academic fashion. Unfortunately, it represents the most recent fad in Old Testament studies.
Rainey coined a biting phrase to describe the movement, mocking its theological and historical implications.
He feared it was being treated as a cure-all for the difficulties of biblical history. It may even be the new panacea of late 20th century Old Testament studies. Regardless of whether the theory was sound, its mere existence complicated the old debates. Regardless of the present methods. But theories are one thing, hard evidence is another. The most damaging blow to the conquest model came from the earth itself.
Et Tel, a ruin of stones, was long thought to be the biblical city of Ai, the site of Joshua's second campaign.
Jericho and Ai are not minor footnotes. They are the crown jewels of the Joshua narrative. Since these are
The Bible is not vague here. It explicitly claims these cities were burned by fire. And since the text is explicit about the cities being burned,
Therefore, these two sites became the ultimate testing ground for the historical accuracy of the conquest.
If the Bible was history, the ground should bear the scars of Joshua's fire. Scholars expected to find evidence of...
At Jericho, the oldest city on earth, the walls that were supposed to fall were strangely absent in the relevant period. The city that Joshua was said to have conquered did not seem to exist in the late Bronze Age. The widespread the situation at Ai was equally damning for the conquest model. At Et Tel, the evidence pointed to a similar gap in habitation.
the very name Ai means the ruin in Hebrew, a poetic hint that perhaps the gap between the destruction of the Israelis.
There was no king to fight and no wall to breach when the Bible says Joshua arrived.
This absence of evidence created a theological and historical crisis for those who held to the Albright synthesis.
If Jericho and Ai were not conquered, the entire conquest narrative began to unravel. The archaeologies.
Scholars were forced to either reject the archaeology or reinterpret the Bible as folklore. This led to a fourth.
The old theory of etiology, that stories were invented to explain ruins, gained new strength. It strengthened the view.
The certainty expressed by Bright and Albright could not survive the silence of the stones.
The field of biblical archaeology had to pivot. It could no longer simply prove the Bible. This necessitated.
This failure of the maximalist view opened the door wide for the Buddhist scholars. The collapse of the conquest.
If the conquest didn't happen, did the Exodus? Did the patriarchs exist? The questioning of the conquest naturally led to the questioning of the earlier traditions.
The skepticism flowed backward in time, from Joshua to Moses and finally to Abraham. The crisis. The era of confidence, the era of Albright and Wright, had effectively ended. The Albright-Wright synthesis.
The stage was now set for a radical rethinking of Israel's origins. Let us now briefly sketch how these arise. The four pillars of the old consensus: archaeology, literary unity, historiography, and
new literary methods were tearing apart the unity of the text. New literary and sociological approaches now rival older continental methods. History was no longer seen as a record of facts, but as an ideological construct.
The hermeneutic of suspicion became the new lens through which all texts were viewed. The emergence of a new skepticism.
It is in this climate of doubt and deconstruction that our current investigation begins.
We must ask not just what happened, but why the story was told this way. We are forced to ask.
Having surveyed the collapse, we must now look closer at the specific evidence that remains.
A new intellectual atmosphere descended upon the academy, known as the hermeneutic of suspicion. The emergence Scholars began to read the text not as a window into the past, but as a mirror of the writer's own political agendas. This resulted in
The very definition of history writing was redefined, stripping the Bible of its claim to report events.
Consequently, the narratives of Genesis through Joshua were rejected as valid sources for historical reconstruction.
Even the old critical methods, like the Wellhausen source theory, began to crumble under new literary pressures.
In the vacuum left by the old methods, new literary and sociological approaches.
These new methods treated the Bible as literature to be appreciated or sociology to be analyzed, but not history to be believed.
The traditional dating of the sources was thrown into chaos, with texts once thought ancient now viewed as late invention.
It was the combination of these factors, archaeological failure, literary shifts, and deep skepticism, that created.
The pendulum had swung so far that the minimalists now controlled the narrative of Israel's origins.
Scholars like John Van Seters and Thomas Thompson led the charge, dismantling the patriarchal age.
They painstakingly argued that the customs of Abraham could belong to a much later era, and could also be documented for the first millennium.
The result was a mass exodus of scholars from the maximalist camp. The result has been an abandonment by many.
The giants of the past, Albright, Bright, Spicer, saw their legacy erode before the eyes of Ecclesia. If the patriarchs, Exodus, and Conquest were gone, what was left of Israel's history? The writers.
Into this vacuum stepped Gösta Ahlström, who proposed writing a history without the Bible. In 1986, the
Ahlström deliberately ignored the first five books of the Bible, deeming use for history a distant.
His thesis was reductionist, stripping away the miraculous and the narrative to find the raw social data.
Robert Coote went even further, claiming the biblical writers invented the periods of history entirely. More recently,
to Coote, the scriptures were information about the writers' minds, not the nation's past.
he argued that the age of the patriarchs and judges never actually existed in time. The period under discussion, therefore, does
These periods never existed.
Comparing Bright's confidence in 1981 to Coote's denial in 1990 reveals the speed of the collapse. This rapid loss of credibility forces us to ask deep questions about the field itself.
As we have seen, no single reason caused this. It was a perfect storm of intellect.
The field is now in a state of crisis, divided between the old maximalists and the new minimalists. In fact,
We must remember the four main developments that brought us here. Let us now briefly sketch how these developments took place.
These developments have set the stage for our own investigation into the truth, and how they set the stage for the present investigation.
We return to the problem of the infiltration model. It cannot explain the violence in the archaeological record. One problem with the infiltration or migrations model.
The cities were destroyed. If not by Joshua and not by Egyptians, then by whom? True, there is nothing.
We only attribute these fires to Israel because the Bible tells us to, ascribing a destruction level at the sites to...
Skeptics argue this is circular reasoning, using the Bible to prove the Bible, biblical in the former and Egyptian in the latter.
Knopf's solution was that the stories were invented to explain the ruins, not the other way around.
Meanwhile, the sociological revolt model faced its own criticism for being too modern.
The original insights were skewed to fit a Marxist worldview. Mendenhall has bristled at the way Gottwald has skewed his original thesis.
Projecting the Industrial Revolution onto the Bronze Age was seen as a fatal flaw. My attempts to warn against such reductionistic interpretations. Yet, Gottwald derided these warnings in his monumental work. Are derided by Gottwald in his...
Rainey's critique of revolting peasant theology highlights the danger of fads in scholarship. This revolt...
Rainey suggested the entire movement should be ignored, but it had already taken root. This book could safely and profitably be ignored.
Despite the critiques, the sociological model remains a thorn in the side of traditional history.
The field reached a stalemate. Conquest was denied, infiltration was insufficient, and always, the silence of Jericho loomed large over every theory. Perhaps the most severe blow to...
The text demanded a burning city, but the ground offered only erosion, since the text is explicit about the cities being burned.
At A, the problem was not just silence, but absence.
These two sites became the anchors that dragged the maximalist ship down. These sites should both serve as test cases for the conquest.
With the old synthesis in ruins, where does the historian go from here? Let us now briefly sketch how...
To find the truth, we must leave the broad theories behind and descend into the dirt of the dig and the ink of the text.